Today, in this webinar, we're going to build on lessons learned from a partnership between the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools. Bellwether served as their research partner to develop a suite of case studies and tools, highlighting effective staffing strategies that can work for schools of all kinds. And in a second, Christy will talk about that project more broadly. Our goal for this webinar is to equip attendees with some actionable strategies so that you can navigate staffing challenges you might be experiencing in your own schools and districts, and do so strategically and allocate resources among the very evolving funding constraints that you're dealing with, and that you do so in a way that truly safeguards instructional time for enhanced student learning. We have a wonderful panel with us today, and Christy will introduce them shortly. But as I mentioned, Christy Wolfe is with the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools, who has been our partner on this project, developing resources that can share learnings from the pandemic and move them forward. Christy is the Senior Vice President for Policy and Research and Planning at the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools. She has more than 20 years of experience working on federal education policy and has been a strong advocate of charter schools ever since her first visit to a charter school in 1998 for a U.S. House of Representatives Committee on Education and Workforce field hearing. She'll introduce our panel in a second. A few logistics. If you haven't already, please go ahead and pop your organization and city in the chat. There is a Q&A box where you can submit all of your Q&A questions in real time. To the extent that they're relevant to the conversation, we'll go ahead and elevate them in the moment. Otherwise, there will be time at the end of the conversation to have an open Q&A. So feel free to pop your questions in the Q&A box and or in the chat. And with that, I'll hand it over to Christy to talk about the project that we've supported them in to provide technical assistance and tools to support schools of all kinds in understanding how they can share forward learnings from the pandemic to address staffing challenges, among other things. Christy?
Thanks, Titilayo. And thanks everyone for joining us during your lunchtime. Whether you're listening to us live or afterwards in a recording, we appreciate you taking the time to join us for this, what will, I think, be a really helpful conversation. As Titilayo mentioned, we have partnered with them as part of our project. This project was funded by the Charter Schools program out of the U.S. Department of Education. And the goal of the project is to create resources and supports that were based on COVID learnings. But as we know, and as I think we'll see today, a lot of the innovations in charters around strategic staffing are really rooted in charter autonomy. And that what we've seen as part of this project is a lot of the learnings are based on practices that were in place prior to the pandemic, but that either took on a new urgency or a new role or evolved during the pandemic and may look differently or may have been expanded. Also, you have the ESSER funding coming on top of that, that provided schools with opportunities to really ramp up some practices that were more narrowly tailored, perhaps prior to the pandemic. But really, charter autonomy over staffing is just a hallmark of what makes charter successful. And we're really pleased to highlight that as part of this and our toolkits that we've done and case studies. The case studies are available on our website. There's the little micro pictures of them here and the cute dinosaur QR if you want to access them that way on our website. I highly recommend the QR code to get directly there. So we didn't just make up everything in the reports or talk to a few people. We actually did a systematic process over the last year that involved focus groups, surveys, as well as site visits. We had 7 in person and 3 virtual. And extensive interviews and, as I mentioned, surveys. So we were really leveraging as many resources as possible, and we tried to make it as easy as possible for folks to engage in the process, recognizing that there are a lot of people that are demanding the time of charter school leaders. Again, appreciating the time that our leaders today are contributing to this effort so we can learn. So that's how we went ahead went through the process of gathering the information. So this is just a diagram of the 6 case studies that we did, and then the 2 toolkits. And today, again, we're focused on prioritizing instructional time and strategic staffing, and we'll talk more at the end about the audit that we have that came out of this work. We're going to go ahead and introduce our panelists today. I'm going to start with John Armbrust. He's with Austin Achieve, and he is the founder and CEO of Austin Achieve, although he's had other roles there. He is a TFA alum from the Metro Atlanta area, and also currently serves on the board of Charter Folk with our friend Jen Walls and the Texas Public Charter School Association, and also the founder of Crossbow Educational Consulting, which sounds like a parallel entity to help districts and states to implement data-driven teacher evaluation processes. We also have Dr. Remy Washington with us today from Uplift Education, where she serves as president. Uplift Education is a public charter school network of 46 schools in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And previously, she served different roles there as the CAO, and she managed their high school. And prior to being at Uplift, she was at Chicago Public Schools. Lastly, I'll introduce Bryan Hassel from Public Impact and Opportunity Culture. He's the co-president of Public Impact and co-leads the Opportunity Culture Initiative, and is a nationwide expert on teacher and principal effectiveness, along with school turnarounds and school funding systems and charter schools and charter school excellence. And he's been a partner of ours as organization in the past and different charter school research and initiatives. And we're super excited to bring him back today to talk about the Opportunity Culture Initiative. So with that, let's get started, the real conversation. So I'm going to start off with you, John. The question, so we're focusing on prioritizing instructional time in this webinar because national surveys, and in general, not just because of the webinar, because national surveys of teachers indicate that they are spending a non-insignificant amount of time doing non-teacher related tasks. And at the National Alliance, we did some poll work with the Harris poll last year, and our polling results found that 3 out of 4 teachers feel that they're often asked or required to do things out of their teaching purview. And that as a result of our survey, it surfaced that about 17% of their workday was supporting their students' mental or physical well-being, and 23% on classroom management. So that's 40% of their time on non-instructional activities. In 2022, another survey, teachers reported spending 18% of their time each week on non-teaching related tasks and about half of their time on directly teaching students. And what's important is that these surveys found that teachers wish that they could spend more time on non-teaching activities, which is not surprising. So those surveys were based on all public teachers and then public school teachers, and then a subsequent data point for just public charter school teachers that we surveyed found that 53% identified restructuring roles to reduce administrative duties as extremely effective practice to retain teachers. One can debate whether 53% is high or low, but unpack that maybe a little bit in our conversation today. So John, as a school leader yourself, how do you assess the need to protect instructional time? And then what steps do you take to understand how teachers are using their time, similar to some of the stats that I just listed out, and how you go about making those decisions? Would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, instructional minutes is everything. And at Austin Achieve, most of our kids will be first in their family to go to college, which I'm sure is very consistent and similar to most of my charter school peers. We exist from a very mission-driven standpoint because we want to provide a great alternative choice for a public school education in our community, like others on this call. So, the way we approach instructional minutes is the key to our success, and that drives all of our decisions. And it doesn't feel like rocket science, but I really love and appreciate the fact that you highlighted it's not just academic needs, it's definitely social emotional learning needs as well. We've certainly seen that since our entire history of existing, now 13 or 14 years of Austin Chi, but ever since the pandemic, COVID has really expanded those needs and that critical importance for intervention minutes and social emotional learning support minutes. So as we review our instructional time and how we budget things, we certainly do that on an annual basis and use data to drive all those decisions. But I think the little tidbit I would think that might be helpful, because I think everyone does that first piece of looking at things holistically and what are our goals and what are the outcomes we're trying to achieve. But I think where we really do a good job is we're very, very diligent about going back with a fine-tooth comb and looking at, like, does lunch need to be 38 minutes or can it be like 33 minutes? Like, every single minute matters. And I would really encourage everyone to just go back and look at everything from like every single minute matters mindset.
And maybe, can you speak a little bit more about how you actually collect the data that you're looking at to make that analysis?
Yeah, I mean, certainly the master schedule at the start of the year that principals create drives the discussion. And then from there, it's always a series of conversations about trade-offs. Like, do we invest more instructional minutes in math and math intervention? Well, how are our math test scores? So I would say our test scores by and large drive a lot of those conversations, but we're also doing pros and cons on the social emotional learning front. So we have an annual, twice annual survey that we do with our our kids, where we're collecting all the different data points on their social emotional progress or lack thereof in some cases. And so that is very much a factor when we're having kind of the holistic approach. Like, okay, we're going to have 300 minutes of math in a given week. Should that be 320 this year? And what's the trade-off? So I think we're just taking a very holistic approach and using test scores in particular, but also social emotional learning type data to be the primary drivers. And I think as a third kind of prong, although candidly, those are the main two drivers, is also looking like electives and extracurricular type activities, because we still want to approach things really holistically and give kids, art and music where we can, but we also recognize that there's just core needs that need to be achieved at the end of the day as well.
Great, thanks, John. Bryan, I'm going to turn to you here and just ask you to talk about the opportunity culture model. Like, what is it? What are you implementing and partnering with districts? This started as a nascent idea and now is, I forget how many districts it's in now, so you can tell us that as well. But how does that help schools with their staffing?
It's really interesting to hear from John. Looking forward to hearing from Dr. Washington in a sec too, because ultimately this all happens in schools, but we're working with schools and districts around the country, and time is really the name of the game. Emily Hassel, who's the co-president of Public Impact, always reminds us adults in schools spend about 60,000 hours a year with kids and doing other things. And so how is that time used? What's the best way to put all of those hours to work? Because that's the real resource that schools have to offer. And often when we're thinking about instructional time, we're thinking about really a lot of the challenges that schools face, like how to retain teachers, how to recruit teachers, and how to keep them over time, how to give equitable access to great teaching. We often think about those problems within the existing structure of teaching, the existing structure of schools. And that's a real constraint on thinking. So what the Opportunity Culture Initiative is about is helping schools step back and rethink roles, rethink time in a way that gets better results for students. And we're working with about 60 plus districts and CMOs around the country now on this Opportunity Culture Initiative. Let me just briefly describe what it is, and then we can come back and talk more about some of the aspects in the Q&A. There's really three components to it. One is what we call multi-classroom leader teams. So instead of teachers working alone, one teacher, one classroom, the norm around the country, teachers join teams, and there's an excellent teacher who's selected carefully to be the leader of that team as the multi-classroom leader educator. And that leader plays a lot of roles, one of which is to organize the time of all the teachers on the team and organize their roles so they can be as effective as possible with the students that they work with. And so that team leader helps them prepare for lessons, helps them look at data together and understand what's going on with their kids, co-teaches and models in other teachers' classrooms, pulls small groups in other teachers' classrooms, as well as often continuing to teach their own classes as well. So it's a true teacher leader role. And the pay possibilities within existing budgets can range as high as $20,000 on top of a normal salary, an average about 20% around the country for these supplements. So it's a high paid advancement opportunity for teachers, and organizing time and roles is a critical part of it. So that's one component. Another component is what we call team reach, where teachers other than the multi-classroom leader educator on a team can also earn more because they're reaching more students. And instead of filling every vacancy, often with a long-term sub, schools using this model find ways for the team to add a paraprofessional or add a teacher resident studying to be a teacher. And then with the teachers that remain, reach the kids as effectively as possible under the leadership of that MCL educator. And then finally, and this is critical to the time part, the third component is the tutoring culture. So the multi-classroom leader, one of their main objectives is to organize the time of everyone on the team so that all adults are doing small group instruction and teaching and tutoring with kids a lot of the time, because we know from research the payoff of that is huge for kids. And the more time they can go into that, the better. And having that team structure with a leader who can organize the time is really critical to getting more teaching and tutoring in small groups happening all through the week by all educators for all kids. So I'll stop there. We can get into more details as we get into the discussion.
Yeah, thanks, Bryan. Look forward to that. Well, Bryan's given us a sketch of what opportunity culture is like in theory. Remy, maybe you can talk to us a little bit about what your experience has been with Uplift piloting the opportunity culture model, and what prompted you to explore new staffing models and how things have been going so far.
Yeah, well, overall, the experience has been, I think, one of excitement and just one that has so many more possibilities. If I had to sum it up in just a few short phrases, I'll start with like what prompted us to look into opportunity culture. Like, quite honestly, our CEO prior to the pandemic had come across something about opportunity culture, and we all kind of looked at it and were like, oh, this is interesting, maybe one day. And then the opportunity presented itself. Well, actually today is the day where we need some solutions around entering a region. So our schools span the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex. Over the last 5 years, 6 of our schools in Fort Worth have grown out completely. And so in that region, there's just like a huge population boom. So we're building schools where we don't quite yet have the student population as well as like the teacher interest to going that far out in the region. And so one of the reasons why we were like, this could possibly be a good opportunity was to like attract just high impact teachers to the Fort Worth region to get those schools started on the right path right out the gate, as soon as they open. The other part was just improving our own teacher retention. It's been challenging for most schools across the country to retain high quality talent. And we found that opportunity culture could provide us with the opportunity to retain some of our most effective teachers, especially those who could go on to be multi-classroom leaders. But also it's attractive to other teachers, novice teachers, to say, oh, there's already going to be support on that campus that makes this campus a little bit more different. So there's an opportunity for us to improve our retention there and just overall teacher effectiveness. I loved how Bryan talked about the small group instruction. That has been game changing for our schools in that region to really think about how do we really reconsider what's most effective for Tier 1 instruction. And so having our Reach associates support with that work has really been game-changing, has impacted the practice across the overall network. Overall, honestly, what we've seen is just the elevation of teacher leadership. When people were making decisions over the last few years on whether or not should I remain in the teaching profession or not, having the option to become a multi-classroom leader for our most effective teachers was one that they were really interested in and allowed them to stay on the campus. They did not want to lead a school, but they didn't want to leave their students either. So it's provided them with just a little bit more of a leadership opportunity, but to be classroom-based. And so that just allowed us to elevate teacher leadership on our campus and gave our school leaders, quite honestly, who were really stretched, an opportunity to share the load and have the support of a multi-classroom leader to ensure that their teachers, especially their novice teachers, were getting support. On some of our campuses, we do a Gallup Q12 staff engagement survey twice a year. We do like a pulse check with our teachers somewhere in early winter. Just like 3 times a year, we actually take a pulse on our employee satisfaction engagement. And we've seen that on those campuses where they have multi-classroom leaders, we've seen an increase in every single one of those campuses, Gallup Q12 scores, just indicating the level of satisfaction that those teachers have on those campuses. And we, there's probably a little bit of noise in terms of actually doing that evaluation, but it's good to see that there's just general positivity around having an opportunity culture on the campus. And then lastly, of course, just like every other school, we look at outcomes, and we've seen that most of our multi-classroom leaders and our teachers within the teaching teams have seen improved outcomes over the last few years of implementation. So it's been a win. I mean, we've learned a lot because there's different ways in which you can model and set up your structures for opportunity culture. But overall, it's been a win for us in our Fort Worth region, and we're looking to expand into some of our Dallas region schools coming up in the next few years.
Thanks so much. Turning back to you, John. So you gave us a kind of an overview of the importance of time and counting the minutes. Can you talk a little bit more about how Austin Achieve has made some staffing changes, some of the similar ones? You're not doing opportunity culture per se, but it sounds like maybe there's some overlap. And also just what some of the hardest things have been to do as well.
Yeah, I mean, every minute, as we were talking about earlier, is just so valuable. And so our approach whenever we have the resources that support it is to expand the number of minutes. It's not necessarily rocket science. So we've always used ESSA funds to expand our school day and school year both. And then with ESSER funds, we were also able to kind of double down on that and expand the opportunity to have bigger impact with instructional minutes. And for us specifically, as I was kind of touching on earlier, the learning gaps just expanded for our community in particular. And so we really emphasized intervention support. So kids who come to us behind grade level are getting extra minutes of instruction, and that's extended school day as well as school year, and just getting extra opportunity to grow and learn. And then we also used ESSER funds specifically to expand our number of social workers that we have on at each campus. So we were able to basically add about 50% to our tally of social workers that are working with our kids. So that's how we've use resources to kind of expand impact and address different needs that we see.
I know in our case study where we visited you all, which I should have mentioned earlier that you were one of our visits, there was a comment that you or someone on your team made that you were using ESSER funds to add additional social workers to decrease that ratio, but you were hoping that maybe that need would decrease, especially as funds were. Have you seen that happen at all, or?
Not really. I mean, hopefully it will happen at some point. I feel like the post-pandemic needs, as I'm sure everyone on this panel and on the webinar agree, we're still very much recovering from all the issues that the pandemic brought in. But we have found creative ways to continue some of those resources because, ESSER funds did dry up for all of us. And those of us here in Texas in particular, we can speak to a very significant budget shortfall because our state funds have been frozen. And I have a feeling that's been consistent across the country. But I just know Texas in particular, it's been really, really, really challenging. So we've had to think outside the box on how we find partnerships and just make everything as efficient as possible. But really expanding our nonprofit partnerships has been a way we've extended a lot of our programs past the ESSER fiscal cliff that existed and into this new state fiscal cliff that we are navigating at the moment.
Remy, I know you all have also invested in specialized staff for mental health and wellness supports. Can you talk about those positions and how they've been helping support classroom teachers?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things we're known for is our Road to College and Career programming. But I think a close number 2 is our well-being supports that we offer our students. Actually, in the fall of 2019, we hired our Chief Wellbeing Officer for our network, Dr. John Gasco, who oversees like our student behavior counseling team, our health services, so like our nursing teams, our athletics teams, and then a small team called our wellbeing team, who really supports all of our social emotional learning and our restorative practice work here in the network. And so prior to the pandemic, we have always had social behavior counselors on campus. So we've got Road to College and career counseling that help with academics, but every single campus has a social behavior counselor in each division, which our CEO has prioritized. And so that we've been doing for at least like the last 10 to 12 years as a network. So they've provided our students with that type of support, ongoing support when students represent a need or family brings in a student who has a need. We do have on-site social behavior counselors to support our students. As the pandemic, like a little bit prior to the pandemic, we did launch a small SEL team who actually just took over most of our SEL curriculum work that usually takes place during the school day and advisory. Post-pandemic, obviously, the mental health needs of our students grew exponentially. And so even though we had some staff, we've had to increase that number of staff members that support on the campus level. We added a new position called a student support specialist, who helps each teacher and students directly with any form of de-escalation or emotional regulation that they may need. And so they're there to help in the moment to support at the campus level. They also do the trainings on campus for classroom management and any other like peer-to-peer relationship building exercises that we may have on campus. It's been pretty neat to just see that team grow in terms of what the supports that they offer. Last year, we launched actually training on campus teachers who are SEL leads who actually support in teacher development and coaching of the teachers on campus to support with any sort of social emotional need that a student has on campus. We use a number of we have a couple of different pulse checks that we do with students regularly. They do these probably twice a week. It's called a rhythm, where we literally just check in with students. It's an emoji-based system where they get to just say how they're feeling that day. And if they want to add text to say, like, actually, I'm pretty hungry or I'm not having a good day, the teacher automatically gets that report during advisory. And they're either able to, if it's a mental health need, it goes directly to the social counselor on campus where they can quickly respond. If it's like around child nutrition, around something with regards to like lunch or just student feeling hungry, it goes directly to our child nutrition programming on the particular campus. And so we just have a way of checking in and also having staff to respond to those most urgent needs that students present during the day. And that's been pretty awesome to be able to respond quickly to both our students and families when they're in need. And so like again, we still are developing like a more wraparound supports for students and really try to develop in the spaces around family counselors, family counseling for families, as we see families that are in need for that type of support, as well as for responding to food insecurity. We did actually launch in partnership with the North Texas Food Bank, a pantry at one of our schools, and we would love to have them on every single one of our Uplift campuses just to support with meeting our students needs with regards to food. And so we do a lot of work around the student well-being, and it's a place that we're continuing to grow and put more resources because our students and our families, they definitely need them in order to be successful in life as well as in school each day.
Great. Thank you. It's super exciting how that has all come together. I mean, you're already talking about like the outcomes that you're using to evaluate your staffing, but maybe we can, all three of you, let's talk a little bit more about how you all evaluate whether the changes you're making are working, so that you can decide whether to maintain that or whether you need to pivot. Bryan, maybe I'll kick it to you to start with, because obviously you've had to look at this a lot as you've developed the opportunity culture program framework for districts.
It's so important to keep an eye on how is this working, and some of the metrics that we really focus on. One, of course, is student learning. So are the changes that are being made boosting student learning? There are a couple of third-party evaluations have shown that when teachers join these multi-classroom leader teams, their student learning grows by about an extra half year annually. And so it boosts the effectiveness of teachers to be part of it. But we see variation about that across the country. And so keeping an eye on that's really important. So student learning is one. Number two is teacher satisfaction. We want these models to be ones that teachers love, because part of the goal is to help attract and retain teachers into the profession over time. And so we survey the teachers every year across the network to see what they think. And we first of all, we see high satisfaction. 99% of multi-classroom leader educators want the models to continue. About 91% of all opportunity culture staff do. But we also learn from those surveys what's not working as well. So for instance, are teacher leaders getting the time that they need to do their job, kind of to your topic today, Christy? And sometimes we find that there's improvements to be made. And so asking the educators how it's going is just a critical part of this. And we learn so much from that every year. And then finally, we also measure sustainability. So are these changes being done within existing budgets so that they can sustain over time and not be ending when a grant ends? And so it's all about, for our model, it's all about taking the current instructional spending, which is primarily in the form of teacher salaries and benefits, and repurposing that to pay these teacher leaders more, to add roles that are focused on tutoring, and to just make that happen from savings that come from things like not filling every vacancy that you have, often with a long-term sub or a teacher that may not be qualified for that role. So using existing dollars to boost learning, measuring that's a really important part of our tracking.
John, anything to add from your experience?
No, that's not on that one.
Remy, anything else you want to say on how you all evaluate?
Yeah, the only other thing that say that we've added, because we do the satisfaction outcome data, is that we've done over the last couple of years more skip level meetings with our staff members, just to see like anything that we're beta testing or piloting, or just the general like sentiment around needs and expectations. And that data has actually been super useful in terms of like decision making, and like to sit side by side on some of the outcome data, and gives us a little bit more insight in terms of like what some of the quantitative data has been sharing with us.
And you've all mentioned outcome data, surveys, different things like that. Do you find, I mean, some of that's a little bit easier to administer in real time? Like, what do you find that there are any limitations in the type of outcome, like student achievement data, assessment data? Like, is that less periodic, or are you doing some intentional assessments? Like, how do you look at that student achievement?
I mean, I think we have enough interim benchmarks and different data points, both at the student outcome level, but also I was thinking through some of the, how we collect feedback on staff. So we have a twice annual teacher condition survey, we call it, but, we're also doing a ton of interim quick snapshot data, at weekly staff meetings, things like that. So I think we're definitely getting a feel for the data, even though those, the big data points might be once or twice per year. I think there's plenty of interim opportunities to collect feedback and kind of get a feel for the direction of where the data is going to land.
One question I want to throw at you all that wasn't something that we talked about necessarily ahead of time, but shouldn't be too hard, is just your experience as a charter school. Remy, you used to be in Chicago public schools. Now you're in charter schools. Bryan, you're working with districts and charter schools. John, you're a charter school. Like, how you see the charter school autonomy over staffing really facilitating this, either implementation of opportunity culture or just overall just auditing teacher time and staffing models.
These changes require, changes. They're varying off of a way we've all thought about schools working for decades, or even more than decades. All the schools we attended, all the schools we've taught at, for the most part, worked in a certain way, and we're talking about upending that and making a really different model. And so on the one hand, charter flexibility can be very valuable for that, because you're able to make changes even within a year or over the course of time to change roles, to change compensation. That's in your hands as a charter leader, perhaps in a way that it doesn't feel quite so nimble for district leaders to have. So there's no doubt about the value of charter autonomy. What I would add is that there's also kind of a barriers of the mind that get in the way of these changes because we're used to doing things a certain way. And so even with legal freedom, there's still the need to step back and engage teachers and educators in the process of thinking through what we want our school to be like. How do we want to organize our time and our roles in a way that gets better results? And that step back is partly about overcoming that mindset of this is always the way we've done it. Instead, let's rethink it, and both districts and charter schools can then move forward in a different direction, as you hear from these other two leaders.
Yeah, like I appreciate Bryan says like the barriers in our mind, because that is typically the only thing that gets in my way in this, even in my current context and just in comparison to my time in a traditional public school. I mean, I think you get the opportunity, if you've got good reflective practices, to step back to say, is this staffing model like helping us get to the end that we intend? And if not, what can we do? And I think that's like a easy muscle for us in the charter sector to have. And it doesn't just happen at the campus level, it happens at the network level too. And I think that to me is where we kind of give the possibilities of what could be more often. Like we have those conversations more often than not, as compared to my time in a traditional ISD. It kind of was like, this is your staffing model from your district. You have some flexibility in there with what you can move around, but for the most part, it is pretty traditional. I think the other thing I think that like John brought up earlier was just like, even when it comes down to the master schedule, how you spend your time and relating that to your staff, like your staffing model is like super critical. And I think that's something that in probably the last 5 years, I've thought more intentionally about than I probably ever have in my entire career. So I think you get a lot more flexibility, but I think it's on all parts of the organization as a charter.
Yeah, I think those are both great answers. And I feel like this whole concept of having flexibility is why a lot of us, if not all of us, join the charter movement, is to have that autonomy. And as I think Remy and Bryan were basically both highlighting, it's a privilege to have that autonomy and that independence to make decisions and be nimble, but it also comes with a burden of responsibility, and we need to be holding ourselves accountable, which is, again, what they're getting at in both their answers as well. So I think it's just really important that we be mindful of the privilege and the need to be accountable for better results, because that's it's a gift that we have to work with.
Super helpful, super interesting. The barriers of the mind. Yeah, we all want to draw circles smaller than the boundaries just to be on the safe side. And that our experience is that, convincing others that you can actually do things and that it will actually lead to good results is a lot of times a big part of the challenge, for sure. I'm sure you all have more stories you could tell about that, and maybe we'll have time in a bit. For now, we've been collecting questions, so I want to turn to those, and I know it looks like some of them have been answered in the chat, but Titilayo, tell us what questions are you seeing out there for from our audience today?
Yeah, there were a couple of questions as we went, and thanks to the panelists for answering a few of them. There was a question about, Lorna had a question about what curriculum Remy uses, and she put in the chat, and I'll voice this over for the benefit of those here and those watching the recording, that they use an in-house curriculum that they develop to support with their PK through 12 college and career readiness supports. There was also a question about just the ratio of student support specialists, and Remy also shared that on most campuses, the goal is to have one. Some might require different staffing choices due to budget, but that's the goal. I wonder, Remy, if there's anything else you wanted to say about those?
Just on the college and career supports, like, honestly, if you're a high school, you have high schools, the career and technical education programming, the course sequences often have a lot of courses that map to some pretty high quality college and career preparedness, like syllabi and content. And so if you're looking for a place to start, there are a number of places where I think you can begin like crafting that curriculum, but it's just something that we've been developing since we started our program, which has probably been about 20 years ago. And so we spend a lot of time refining and making adjustments to the year-over-year scope and sequence for our teams on that end.
And there was also a very practical question. Someone was intrigued by your description of the chief of wellbeing officer, as well as the student support specialist. And I love the question because one of the goals that the National Alliance had for this project was to really create resources and share out exemplars and tools that schools could use. And Dr. Washington has shared separately that she's happy to share those links. So in the follow-up email for this webinar for everyone who's registered, we'll include a roundup of resources that have been mentioned here. There was another question in the chat about, there were a couple of questions for Bryan, just about what that multi-classroom lead model looks like. Does that lead organize the time of individuals outside of their team if children need it, or do they solely work within their own teams? Bryan provided an answer in the chat about that, and just wondered if you had anything else to say, Bryan, about what that model looks like.
What we're really aiming for with this model is to reach all students with excellent teaching. And the best way to do that is to have multi-classroom leader teams across the school. So all the educators are part of a team led by a great teacher and getting that support. There may be an interim period of time when that's being phased in. And during that time, we see those MCL educators sometimes pulled in other directions to help across the school. But the goal is to have those intimate teams that you can get great support from those teacher leaders every day because it's across the school.
We have one more question. I wonder, well, there was an earlier question for John about what they use for their SEL data. And in the response bubble, he shared they measure a lot of different things, such as how much the lessons are being delivered per week, social worker check-ins, and things that he's already talked about in the conversation. If there's anything else you wanted to share on that, John, you're welcome to. But I know that there's been some interest throughout the conversation around what that support looks like and how you really think about data to track what's happening and evaluate what changes might be made moving forward.
Yeah, similar to what others have offered, I'd be happy to send kind of a toolkit we have for things on the SEL front, and that correlates pretty closely to how we approach discipline with our restorative practices. And we have a whole toolkit, I mean, completely separate topic, but we've got a lot of things on that front as well that I'd be happy to share with anyone on the webinar.
And one question we have for everyone is if you all would be willing to talk about how this issue of strategic staffing intersects, and specifically strategic staffing to maximize instructional time, how that intersects with managing school culture. So you talked about mindset and change earlier, right? Are staff ever resistant to making changes to their school day, week, year to maximize instructional time? Do folks in non-instructional roles ever get frustrated or upset when administrative tasks are shifted away from teachers and onto them? There's a question about what this really looks like when it comes to managing change and implementing some of these models. Anyone can jump in first.
I think the answer is all the above. Yes. I mean, I think what I've learned, because there was a point, right, like in the pandemic right after, we're making a lot of changes because schooling looked and felt differently. I think over the last couple of years, we've definitely slowed down. And one of the things that we got smarter about over the last few years was getting staff input often and early on things that we were thinking about would be the things that move the needle. And sometimes we found that there was little to no interest, and that's probably not a good place to start. The other places we found that we had a lot of energy, and we thought that those were better places for us to start establishing some building blocks to begin some of the work. I'd say that, on probably one of my latest changes that we made, I think that one of the most important things for us was honestly just having our staff be a part of making the change. And that has definitely gotten us some really positive momentum and allowing them to see success along the way. And standardize, we're trying to standardize a bit more. We've got a large network, so you can imagine the variability across over 40 something schools within a network. And so just naming each year what we will seek to to standardize as a team. And I think that going slow, getting input, building with one another has been really helpful in allowing us to manage change a lot better than I would say we were probably 5 years ago when during the pandemic.
Yeah, I definitely would agree. Kind of yes to all. It's definitely challenging, but for us, and I think everyone here, I mean, the better we communicate things, the better it goes. And when we misstep on communication, that's when we have our biggest challenges. And I feel like, a team of educators will always rally around in a way that's best for kids. That's who we are. But if we don't communicate the why behind that and why we're doing these crazy things that we're doing, questions get asked and people get frustrated, and naturally so. I certainly don't blame them for any of that. So really at the core, it's just communicating and thinking through. It's not just a message to your staff. It's like, okay, what do I message the school leaders? When do I message that? How do I explain that and get them on board? It's a whole cadence in a series that you just have to think through and do it really thoughtfully and strategically whenever you're making any change that's substantial.
Bryan, anything else you want to add to that? There's a follow-up question about this around how this messaging plays out with families in particular. How do you all message strategic staffing to families? Any success stories about collaboration with families that have helped further optimize teacher time or just help students adjust to changes? Wonder if you have any thoughts on change management generally, or how families do play into this, and that could be for everyone, including Bryan.
Yeah, families can be there. They've lived in the same system as well, so they can be nervous if things are looking different. Particularly moving towards a team structure where I've been used to having one teacher who's my kid's teacher every year at the elementary level, or one math teacher, one science teacher, et cetera, at the secondary level. Moving to a team structure that can be concerning for families, and so I'd be interested to hear how John and Remy have approached this, but families can be engaged and shown that what's the value of this to my child. And if they ask their children will often say things like, well, I have two teachers now, or I have 3 teachers now that are helping me be successful, or I'm getting more support than I got last year because I've got this multi-classroom leader educator who's coming into my classroom every few days. But if you see that kind of value, then families understand. But going to John's point, if that's not communicated, if that's left murky, then you can see some real problems emerge because families will think, what's happening here? I'm not getting what I'm expecting.
Yeah, one of the things that we did was we do POSSUP. It's like a monthly pulse check for survey for our families. And on the survey, you can put like one of your own questions. So families get to say how things are going and answer the general questions, but we can put one question per month. That's like our bonus question. We generally put like a bonus question for something that we're thinking about that's come up that we want families to address. And so we like probably 5x the number of like surveys in general that we've put out to parents like over the last couple of years, but like things around campus safety in particular, when it came to strategic staffing around that, where we've had to add security officers on our campuses here in Texas, like per state law. But we went with them on that journey because that was something new to us to add that type of staffing on our campus, as well as some of our restorative practice work, which was like challenging to think about, but that's where a lot of the student support specialist ideas were pressure tested with our parent base. And so we kind of use the similar approach that we use with our staff because it's just, and during the pandemic, it was just really like, heartbreaking that many of our families, we weren't their first call. Like they did not reach out to us. We had to search high and low for them, and that we want to change that, going into this next phase of our work to make sure our families know that we are a resource to them. And that we've got pretty much an open door communication where we just have a reciprocal relationship around what's happening at our schools. And so we use a similar approach, but it's more monthly, and we try to be really strategic around how we what questions we ask. And so they can get early input on things that we're thinking about and considering with regards to strategic staffing.
John, do you want to add anything on
that? Just echoing, we use the POSSUP survey as well. So that kind of brief snapshot to get parent data is really helpful. So I definitely echo everything there too with the exact same tool.
Great. Well, as far as questions, that's all we have so far. Of course, you all are welcome to still put them in the chat. I'll toss it back to Christy to just close this out, and then we'll put a couple of links in the chat as well for reference.
Yeah, well, just one last question, maybe before I close out the entire webinar. What you see going forward, like what you're concerned about to be able to do more of what you're doing, sustain what you're doing, expand depending on your different contexts. If you feel like the winds are shifting when it comes to hiring and finding staff. And if you see this as really about working with your teachers and not so much an additional cost going forward. Yeah, just like, what are your top concerns to keep the work going forward? We'll do scattershot here. Bryan, you go first. You look like you're about to talk.
Looking ahead and thinking about post-ESSER, how can schools and districts around the country and CMOs make the kind of transitions that you hear Remy talking about in Uplift, where what we're trying to do is make that much more accessible to CMOs and districts. So we're creating a online portal that's about to open where districts and schools can go through more of a do-it-yourself process, where they could get help from public impact, or they could do it on their own or some blend, just to make this more something that any district and any CMO can undertake. And it's been great to have the leadership of places like Uplift. But what's the next phase? It's that broader reach, because teachers, schools everywhere have these needs. And so how can we spread new kinds of staffing models far and wide? That's really our obsession right now.
John, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, I guess you asked us to highlight concerns, and I think my just overarching concern is like, yeah, there's just a lot of urgency post-COVID, and we saw ESSER funds flow in, and obviously those have now expired, and I just worry that kind of the urgency behind throwing more resources at our work that we're trying to accomplish is going to wane a bit, when really we still are trying to overcome really substantial challenges on behalf of the kids we work with. So that worries me. And then I think there very much is still a post-COVID hangover with like how families approach just attending school on a consistent basis. I mean, our attendance rate is still off by about a percentage or 1.5% than our pre-COVID norm. And that's, I think, pretty consistent. And in Texas, we are directly funded on not just enrollment, but actual daily attendance. So we're still dealing with a 2% cut on our funding in addition to the state freezing dollar. So again, kind of speaks to that like urgency. But I guess pivoting to hope and being optimistic, I think every challenge presents opportunities for solutions, and we've had to think way outside the box in ways that are thoughtful and constructive and strategic that we never have before. So I think long term, it's going to benefit us greatly, but short term it's challenging, and there's definitely a lot of concerns out there that we're dealing with.
And I'll just add ditto to what John said. We've got the same concern list. I think things that we've got to think about is just a complete redesign of our school day so that we're optimizing our time and our staff. And so I think this is like, with all the kind of things that are pulling at us to like, be it attendance or parent engagement or funding, I wonder, just like John, how do we just use this to be an opportunity to just, how do we redefine so we're optimizing the resources we have and we're optimizing our staff time so that they stay invested in the work for a long time? I think that is probably the most important thing on my mind right now.
Thanks. Well, to the point of providing resources or supporting charter schools that want to do this work, or any school, we have a teacher time audit that's part of the toolkit. As a place to start for those who may be on the webinar that are looking for resources. And we also have technical assistance available for schools that are interested in looking at this more closely. Titilayo is going to put a survey in the chat here, and it'll tell you how to access our resources and TA. So click on that. But also happy to follow up if you have any questions or want to talk about this anymore. Thank you, everyone, our panelists today, everyone for being on our webinar. It's been an encouraging conversation. I think even as we talk about the challenges towards the end, we always have those, and we work together to try to move forward to keep kids at the center and student outcomes, especially in this post-pandemic era. So thanks again, and we look forward to seeing you all sometime next time we have a webinar. So thanks.